Well, I'll say that if I didn't have a Bible up here with me to say something worthwhile, I, by myself, would seem pretty anticlimactic. Thank you, Austin. Very good song selection today, all around. Thank you for your participation this morning, to all of you in our worship service. To our visitors with us today, perhaps for the very first time that you're here, I want to encourage you to fill out a visitor's card. It's in a small rack in the pew in front of you. At the end of our worship today, a few of our members will come around with a basket and collect those visitor's cards. We would absolutely love to know if you have a spiritual need that we can help you with. If you'd like to sit down and have a Bible study and find out what it means to become a Christian and what that life involves, then we would love to open up our Bibles together and study that with you. Let us continue in our worship at this time by having our Bibles open to Psalm 39. Psalm 39. And I will admit something to you as you turn your Bibles to Psalm 39. As a preacher, it's often expected that I have all of the questions answered, that I don't have any doubts, that I'm supposed to have all the answers that you need, and that I don't go to bed at night sometimes with prayers that maybe make me feel a little bit guilty after I say amen. This is not an easy life to endure. And it sure feels sometimes like there are questions that I can't answer. And I simply must propound them to God and leave it be. There are things I look at in the news, injustices around the world, and injustices in the lives of the people around me. Things that just don't line up properly, at least as the way I think that they should. Life just doesn't turn out the way it ought to. Life is not a romantic comedy. Life is not a poem that always has a pretty ending. Life isn't tidy. And sometimes we just want to go to God in prayer and say, why? Why? But because we don't want to show a chink in our armor or a crack in our invulnerability to unbelievers, we'll swallow those questions and pretend they don't exist. Because we would rather say nothing honest and possibly embarrass ourselves in front of unbelievers or embarrass God or cause an unbeliever to have something to accuse us of. We would rather say nothing honest at all than say something that could get us in trouble. That is the situation that the writer of Psalm 39 was in. He speaks of the vanity of this life, the shortness of this life. He speaks of the way that it just doesn't seem like things always fit right, that things don't always match up the way that he thinks that they should. While he's being disciplined for God because of his sins, other people seem to get away with their sins without any discipline at all, without any consequences at all. And maybe, as the subtitle says, maybe if David is the one who wrote it, and if he was alive today, he might turn on the news just like we do. He might check his Facebook page just like we do. He might get a phone call from his doctor the way that we often do. He might get that email about the friend or the family member that is facing a trial of some kind, and he too might have questions that he feels like he has to swallow or bury or ignore because he's got enemies all around him who would just love to see him fail somehow. Oh, the man of great faith has questions, huh? Oh, Charlie Church isn't Mr. Perfect, is he? You mean to tell me you believe in this almighty God of yours who has a great plan for all of us and who loves us and cares about us? And He hasn't wrapped up your life nice and tidy like a Christmas present, huh? We all have people in our lives who are waiting to pounce upon our insecurities. And we don't want to show those insecurities. We'll hide them and bury them until they cause a spiritual cancer inside of us that we don't even know what to do with anymore. Read with me, if you'd like to follow along in your Bibles, in verses 1 through 5 of Psalm 39. And we'll stop and make comments along the way. I said, we're going to stop and make a comment. One of the first problems that we have when we are faced with difficult questions that confront our faith is we say, I said. I thought to myself. I tried to rationalize it. I tried to be logical about it. I tried to be reasonable about it. I sat and stewed and brewed, and I thought long and hard about my problems in life. His first problem was the very fact that he said, I said. Because sometimes there's nothing for us to say. Sometimes all we can say is, God, let your will be done. I'm a tiny speck. I'm dust on the ground. My life is like a handbreadth. My life is like vapor that passes away. I don't have the perspective to provide commentary on everything that happens out there. So that's problem number one in Psalm 39 is, I said, because that's the moment he stuck his foot in his mouth. I said, I will guard my ways that I may not sin with my tongue. And at first you might be thinking, well, that's a good attitude, isn't it? Shouldn't we be commending David for guarding his lips so that he might not sin with his words? And yes, in part that's true. There is a degree to which we need to put a filter on the things that we say to make sure what we're saying isn't causing us or anybody else out there to stumble. But David takes it too far, as we also often do. Look what he says here. I will guard my ways that I may not sin with my tongue. I will guard my mouth as with a muzzle while the wicked are in my presence. I'm going to put a muzzle on myself, and I'm just not going to say anything. I'm just not going to say anything. As long as there are wicked people in my presence, I'd hate to say something that'll give them evidence or ammo or something they can pounce upon. And again, give him credit for having self-control. But when self-control runs riot to the point that we won't say anything at all anymore, where we're so paralyzed by the fear of saying something wrong that we just won't say anything at all, that's when it becomes a problem. He says, I'll muzzle my mouth. I'll muzzle my words so that when the wicked people around me look at my life, I'm not going to give them any ammo that they can throw back at me as a man of faith in God. Now here's the result though. Here's the result when he takes this silence, this muzzling of his mouth too far. Verse 2, I was dumb and silent. I refrained even from good. Other translations, like English Standard Version, will say, I refrained from even saying anything good, saying good things. I refrained even from good. Now you see where the problem is, right? He was so paralyzed by the fear of what if that he just didn't do anything. He didn't say anything, didn't do anything. We cannot live in fear, my friends. We cannot treat life like it's an icy lake. We cannot step out like this with so much trepidation that we won't do anything anymore. David says, I was so afraid of saying something wrong that I just didn't say anything at all. I didn't even say good things. I didn't even say good things. How paralyzed do you have to become? I refrained even from good, and my sorrow grew worse. Imagine that. Bottling things up inside of you doesn't actually make you feel better. Now, maybe David had legitimate questions for God. He should have asked them, as he does in a lot of other Psalms. You notice in other Psalms, David is not afraid of saying, why, God? Why are you so far away? Why does it feel like I've been abandoned? Why are the wicked people out there living in luxury while I'm suffering over here? Why do wicked people seem to get away with their sins while the righteous are punished for their good deeds? He's not afraid of asking why in other Psalms, and we need to learn a lesson from that. That it is okay to ask God tough questions. as long as we're willing to accept the answer that we get. See, that's the key, isn't it? There's nothing wrong with watching the news and saying, God, why haven't you come back in judgment yet? This world is a complete disaster. It is a mess. I don't even know if I want to raise my children in a world like this any longer. Why, God? Why? Now, there's nothing wrong with asking the question, if you can accept the answer that God gives, which I suppose, if God did answer us directly, might be something along the lines of, you people have created the mess. I didn't do that. I didn't invent terrorism. I didn't invent crime. I didn't invent murder. Cain did. Cain invented murder. If you want to be mad about somebody about inventing murder, that wasn't me. Now, are you willing to accept an answer like that? Are you willing to accept a tough answer for an equally tough question? Because I guarantee you, we are not confusing God. God is not flummoxed by that. When somebody out there says, why, God? Why do I have cancer? Why have I lost this loved one? Why did I lose my job? You know, God's not up in heaven going like, whoa, I didn't see that one coming. I'm just shocked. I'm flummoxed. God is not flummoxed or flabbergasted or whatever other word you can find in the dictionary or thesaurus for it. He's not. He's not confused. It's when we bottle these things up inside Him where we're not willing to ask them or talk about them, especially in public as a church. When a church isn't willing to ask the tough questions about why we believe what we believe. When a church isn't willing to confront tough social issues, things like racism or pornography addiction. When a church isn't willing to ask the tough questions, all we're doing is just bottling those things up inside. And as David says, my sorrow actually grew worse. I actually felt worse. The more I bottled it up inside of me, the worse I ended up feeling. So in verse 3, my heart was hot within me. My heart was hot within me because when it comes to truth, when it comes to our burning questions, you just can't keep them inside forever. While I was musing, the fire burned. Then I spoke with my tongue. Lord, make me to know my end, and what is the extent of my days. Let me know how transient I am. Maybe in modern vernacular, David is saying, put me in my place, God. I have so many questions. I have doubts. I have fears. I'm anxious. You've asked me to not be anxious. I'm scared, and you've told me not to be scared as long as I'm in your presence. I have questions when you've said there are questions that won't be answered in this life. As long as we have physical eyes to see and physical ears to hear and physical bodies that need physical things, there are just some things that we're not going to understand in this life. Lord, help me know my place. Help me comprehend how transient and how passing and how brief my physical life is. And it is amazing, by the way. And I'm not saying I'm perfect at this, because in the beginning of the lesson, I was trying to be blunt with you. I have questions too. There are things that I struggle with as well. Questions that I don't know if I've got the answer for them just yet. And maybe I won't until I die and I actually see God face to face. But maybe that's the thing, isn't it? You know, as long as we're physical beings, stuck in time, stuck with our physical desires, facing the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the boastful pride of life, as long as we're stuck in this situation, stuck in this tent, as 2 Corinthians 5 would describe it, this temporary dwelling place where we're living, as long as we're stuck here, we just don't have the perspective to know some things. We'll never know some things, and we have to be okay with that. We have to be okay with that. I don't know what the Great Wall of China looks like, except what I see in pictures. And until I'm willing to fork it over and take a trip to China and see it, I have to be content with the perspective that I have. I can look at it in pictures and that's it. That is my perspective. That is it. And I have to accept that. I have to accept that. I have to accept the limitations of my situation, the limitations of my physical body. And if I can learn to accept then maybe some of the questions I have can actually get answered. You know, we say things like, why did I lose my job? Why is my body sick or broken? Why did I lose that loved one? And God's answer is, because nothing lasts forever in this life, and I didn't design it to be that way. And when Adam and Eve sinned, they entered into a situation where something that was already physical in nature became corrupted by sin. So something that is already designed to be physical and limited is now further corrupted by mankind's universal sin. We're not meant to live forever. We can't live forever, at least in this physical sense. And if it's not a car accident, something else is going to get you along the way. A rattlesnake bite or a brain aneurysm. You're not going to live forever. And every job doesn't last forever. And every house falls apart. And money sprouts wings like an eagle and flies away. That is the fact of the matter. Shed the physical and start seeing the spiritual, and maybe the questions get answered, though. He goes on to say in verse 5, Behold, thou hast made my days as handbreadths. One could maybe see it as on a cool morning, not in Phoenix. We have a young man who just moved here from Fort Collins, Colorado. He could probably understand this a little bit better. On a cool morning and you see the vapor leave your mouth, a breath that disappears after a second or two. You know, from God's eternal perspective, that's about all life is to Him, is a handbreadth. A vapor that disappears, that passes. That's how much substance it has. Yet we put all the stock in it. See, that's the irony, isn't it? To God, our physical lives are a vapor passing through the air. To us, our physical lives are everything. Our physical lives are the solid rock upon which we build everything. Our hopes and our dreams. And maybe if I can provide a little bit of commentary that's maybe off to the side of Psalm 39 just a bit. This is something that's been weighing on me a lot lately. I've been thinking a lot lately about why is it that a lot of our young people fall away? Why is it that a lot of our young people fall away in this day and age? And my commentary on that is this. I think even Christians have put far too much emphasis on the flesh. Far too much emphasis on the flesh. When we talk to our young people, what is almost always the conversation we have? What are your grades like? Did you make varsity? Where are you going to college? What career are you going to have? Oh, you're going to do that? Well, that doesn't pay a whole lot of money, you know. You know, every time somebody says they want to follow their dreams or their passions and do something that's actually going to fill their life with something meaningful, we go, well, you know that doesn't pay very much, do you? Like, well, since when does that matter? You got one life to live, and there's plenty of money out there and plenty of people with money who are not actually living. And when all of our focus is on, you've got to get the best grades, and you've got to go to college, and you've got to get a great career, and you've got to marry the right person, and live in the right neighborhood, and have the right house, and make the money, well, why should we be so shocked when they stop caring about God? Look at that. Doesn't surprise me at all. That doesn't surprise me. So God looks at life as a handbreadth, and He's calling us, beckoning us onto heaven, saying, stop putting so much stock in something that's passing and live for something that's substantial and eternal and real. Your soul. And we're on the complete opposite end of it going, it's all about money, and it's all about college, and it's all about your career. Well, let's not be so shocked that we reap what we sow when it comes to our conversations with our young people and the emphasis that we place on them. Surely, he says in verse 5, my lifetime is as nothing in thy sight. Every man at his best is a mere breath. Ooh, that's humbling. That's humbling. You remember the time in your life when you were at your best? You know, when you're in your mid-30s and life is good. And think about that point in your life when life was at its best. Maybe you hit your peak in high school. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, if your golden years or your best years were high school, I don't know about that. People always say like high school and college, those are your best years. Like, I don't think so. I don't know. I like life better now than I did back in high school. My face is a lot less blotched than it was back in high school. Though Rebecca would say, yeah, but you've got that ugly, scraggly thing on your face right now. But think about your best year, or the best period in your life, the best phase of your life. At your very best, you were a mere breath, and then it passed. Now, I don't think David's being cynical about this. I mean, you could interpret Psalm 39 in a really cynical way, but I don't think he's being cynical about it. Remember, this is written from the perspective of a king who lived in a palace, who won almost every battle that he fought, and in almost every sense of the word was a complete success in his life. David is adored. He is adored in hindsight. Thousands of years later, we see him as this paragon of faith. At his best, he recognized that he was just a mere breath. Now he takes a step further as we go on to verse 6 and go through verse 11. Surely every man walks about as a phantom. Surely they make an uproar for nothing. He amasses riches and does not know who will gather them. That reminds me of Ecclesiastes chapter 2. Near the end of that chapter, he talks about how there's nothing better for a man than to eat and drink and tell himself that his labor was good. And that's a gift from God. And if you can keep God in the picture and have a God perspective on things, there is nothing wrong with enjoying the brief things of this life in their place. But in the last couple of verses of Ecclesiastes 2, he says, to the sinner, God has given the task of gathering and collecting so that somebody else can come along later and enjoy those things. The task of gathering and collecting, that's my favorite verse in Ecclesiastes 2, by the way, because it just sums up life. It's an episode of hoarders. It's an episode of storage wars. The task of gathering and collecting is what we are given to do. He amasses riches and does not know who will gather them. Verse 7. And now, Lord, for what do I wait? For what do I wait? I wait for the next season of my favorite show to come out on Netflix. I wait for the next season of football because the Ducks have been bad a couple years and we've always got next year. If I'm in the position of waiting to get married, then I'm always wanting to rush along to that next phase of life. And the newlywed is always wanting to rush along to the next phase of life. And people, by the way, don't ever ask a newlywed, so when are you going to start having kids? Don't ask that. Our young people are trying to rush along fast enough as it is. Don't rush them any further. Now, Lord, for what do I wait? The next big thing in life, the next presidential election, the next iPhone, the next big pay raise, the next big break. Oh, for what do I wait? My hope is in Thee. Deliver me from all my transgressions, he says in verse 8. Make me not the reproach of the foolish. I have become dumb. I do not open my mouth because it is Thou who hast done it. And he recognizes that every situation that he faces has some God behind it. Now, let's understand something. That doesn't mean that God causes every flu, that God causes every illness, that if you lose your job, it was somehow God pulling strings and working gears to make you lose your job. That's not what he's saying. But he recognizes that every situation that he faces, illness or the loss of a job or the loss of a loved one, every situation that he faces has a little bit of God behind it, and a big opportunity to show his faith. It's opportunities, isn't it? So he asks in verse 10, Remove thy plague from me. Because of the opposition of thy hand, I am perishing. You will only ever succeed in life because God allows you to succeed. And if He doesn't want you to succeed, you won't. Kyle made a great point in our 9 a.m. lesson. Made a great point about Ai. Ai in Joshua chapter 7 and 8, Ai was really confident because they believed they had precedent on their side. They were very confident because they had a nice city. They had some success in the past. And like Kyle pointed out, the only reason that Ai survived the first attack from Israel in chapter 7 of Joshua was because God allowed them to survive. And the only reason Jericho was still standing in the time of Joshua was because 40 years earlier, God allowed them to keep standing because of the failure of that generation of Israelites. Now again, that doesn't mean that God causes you every time you get better from an illness. I'm not saying He doesn't at times. I'm not limiting in any way His providential power. I'm just saying every time you get better from the flu, that wasn't necessarily God. Every job that you get or every pay raise isn't necessarily God miraculously pulling strings on your behalf. But every success or every failure at the end happened because God allowed it to happen and because God created the environment and the conditions on planet Earth for those things to even happen. Grass only grows because God allows grass to grow, and He created the soil and the sun and the rain. Because of the opposition of thy hand I am perishing, verse 11, with reproofs thou dost chasten a man for iniquity, thou dost consume as a moth what is precious to him. Surely every man is a mere breath. Let us bring our lesson to a close now with the last two verses. Hear my prayer, O Lord, and give ear to my cry. When I do have those doubts, God, listen to my doubts. Like Psalm 103 says, the Lord is like a father who treats his son with compassion. He knows what our frame is. He is mindful that we're but dust. He knows we're limited. He knows we have a very limited perspective. He knows we're physical beings with physical frailties. He knows that. And when you say that you're anxious and you lay that anxiety upon Him, and when you say that you're suffering and you put that suffering on His lap to be dealt with, and when you say that you are sad or broken or doubting, and you give that to Him to be His burden, He's not surprised by it. He's not shocked by it. My dad was not surprised the times that I failed as a teenager. I'm not surprised when one of my kids, when they were toddlers, fell on their face because they couldn't walk very well. That didn't surprise me because I was mindful of what they are and their limitations. And God is very mindful of your limitations as well. Do not be silent at my tears, for I am a stranger with thee, a sojourner like all my fathers. Do you have that perspective? Do you believe that this life is a journey where it's you and God taking on the world? Because so often the world sees it from the opposite side, where it's all of us taking on God. God's repressing us. God's keeping us down. God is commanding us to do all these things. And God's going to judge us one day and send us to hell if we don't do every one of His biddings. You know, David saw it from the other side. He said, you know, God, I'm a stranger with you. I have cast my life with you. I've made my choice. I'm not with the sinners of the world. I'm not with the wicked. I'm not with the majority anymore. I've made my choice. I want to be a stranger with you. Hebrews 13 talks in the same language. Hebrews 13 talks about the way that Jesus is outside the camp. He's cast out. He was the guilt offering. Let us go to Him outside the camp, bearing His reproach, like the outcasts that we are called to be. Turn thy gaze away from me in terms of punishment, that I may smile again before I depart and am no more. Now, I know that Psalm 39 doesn't end on an exactly high note, but here's what I want to do with that last phrase. You have an opportunity before you are no more to set your life right with God, to accept the invitation that He has offered to each and every one of us, and to become a Christian this day. If it's true that you're just a breath, a vapor that is here one moment and passes away the next, if it is true that at any moment we may fall prey or victim to any number of physical calamities, then before you are no more, make sure that you are everything to God. Become one of His children, one of His people, a saint, right now, this day. Whatever spiritual need you have, please let it be known by coming forward as we stand and sing.